Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Values Interaction Scotland 50-year anniversary. 50 years, half a century of Values Interaction Scotland when this organisation was founded. This is a live stream that's brought to you by the power of StreamYard. This is going to be broadcasted from our Values Interaction Scotland Facebook pages and also our LinkedIn pages as well. So thank you everyone from both platforms for stopping by today. This is going to be a session that's followed up by from Monday to Thursday. So from Monday is going to be the 1970s, Tuesday the 1980s, and then so on and so forth, the 1990s, and also the 2000s as well. Today is all about the 70s. So this seminar celebrates the pioneering work carried out by the 70s, and we are delighted to be joined by amazing panelists of people, Ann Shearer, Peter Moss, Paul Williams, and Alan Tyne, who will talk about what life was like for people with learning disabilities during that time period, and also what motivated them to campaign as well. But before we get into any of that at all, I have got a presentation. This presentation basically shows you what else happened in this particular decade from 1969 up to 1971. So let's begin from there. So, and again, guys, welcome. We've got 10 people watching. How are you all doing? So we've got some comments already flying in. So hello, Mark, how you doing? So let's do this now. So we're going to be looking at the 70s. So before we get into the panelists, in 1969, the very first man went into space. On the 20th of July, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to ever land on the moon. About 6.5 hours later, Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. As he took his first step in 1969, he famously said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." In 1970, this marked the new digital age for communication. For too long, people have been using telephone boxes, the big, massive, annoying brick phones that people used to carry in their bags. Sending faxes, sending letters in the post was an absolute thing of the past. Thanks to the phone company Motorola, they introduced a brand new smartphone called Motorola 8000X. This started a brand new age for the phone industry. In 1971, the most richest person in the world was born, Elon Musk. He was born in Pretoria, South Africa. He's an entrepreneur, a business tycoon. He is the founder and chief executive of companies such as SpaceX and Tesla. In 1972, before getting things done in the office, doing maths was a struggle in the office, to be honest with you. People were getting their heads down, trying to do maths on sheets of paper, but not anymore, because in 1972, the world's first scientific calculator was made, the HP 35. This brought a new age to the calculator world. In 1973, now this is a big one, the United States ends its involvement in the Vietnam War. After the signing of the Paris Peace Accordings during January, the agreement was signed between Vietnam and South Vietnam and the United States. The formal name of the agreement, an agreement ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam, and it detailed an all-round ceasefire in Vietnam and the withdrawal from US forces and removal from US bases to be completed within 60 days. In 1974, a hard-fought campaign by a charity and organisations, including the Scottish Society for Mentally Handicapped Children. In Scotland, people were given the right, so children with learning disabilities and autism were given the right to go to the same school as anybody else. In 1975, a massive employment crisis in the UK. The UK hits unemployment by 1 million, the first time in history. In 1976, the Prime Minister Harold Wilson resigns, the Labour leader for 13 years. The Prime Minister the Prime Minister lead in the UK for 13 years. And also it was a massive shock for the UK public announcing his resignation. In 1977, the Silver Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain took place. It was celebrated with a large-scale parties and parades throughout the United Kingdom and also in the Commonwealth. In 1978, the world's first IVF baby was born. A little before midnight on the 25th of July, Louise Brown was born, weighing in at 5 pounds and 12 ounces. IVF stands for virtual infertilization. It is a method of assisted reproduction, and this little girl was considered a miracle baby. In 1979, the Conservative Party won the general election, and Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, taking over from James Callaghan. She was the first female Prime Minister to take over the UK. She later was named the Iron Lady because of her tough approach to politics. So, thank you everyone for listening into that part there. So, now that we've got ourselves out of that presentation, we've now got our exciting panelists to talk to now. So, I would like to introduce the fabulous Paul Williams, Ann Shearer, Alan Tyne, and Peter Moss. So take it away, guys, and the stage is now yours.
We need to unmute ourselves, don't we?
Unmute.
I was on a small screen. I couldn't see it. So here we are. Right. So, shall I begin as I was there first, as it were? Really, the person who started CMH, as it was from the beginning, campaign for the mentally handicapped, and then called Campaign for Mentally Handicapped People. The person who started it was a wee boy called Alexander, who lived on a children's ward in a very, as it turned out, famous subnormality hospital north of London, for that's what they were then called. That I was working on The Guardian. I was their what they call welfare correspondent. And one of my jobs was to field the letters to the editor to see if they were worth publishing. And there'd been a big fire in a mental hospital in Shropshire, which got a lot of publicity and a lot of shock because it turned out the beds were so crammed in the corridors that 40 old people died. They couldn't be evacuated. You can imagine there was a great shock about that. A woman wrote to The Guardian saying, "You think this is bad? Let me describe the ward my nephew lives in." And this letter was passed to me in the course of my duties. And I thought, well, if half of this is true, this isn't a letter to the editor, this is a story. So I met her and we went up and we saw the little boy. And it was very, very shocking. It was very shocking. Lots of children milling about, very dirty, great mixture of ability and disability, very active little children sort of knocking into kids with advanced hydrocephalus who were in little day cots on the floor. And one young nurse trying to manage this, who spoke very little English. So I came back and I told the news editor. And he said, "Are you sure? Are you sure you saw that?" And I said, "Well, yes, I did, actually." I was so shocked. He was shocked. Even he was shocked. So there followed a long story of preparing the story for the paper. It went to the lawyers. It went back again. And really, if you read that story now, you'd say, well, yes, that's the way it was then. But these were very secret places in those days. So anyway, that was published in The Guardian as a piece. And interestingly, the only people who responded to it were people with a professional interest, like the chief executive of MENCAP and social workers, a few social workers. But nothing like the outcry there was when the press council, the hospital complained to the press council that this was an inaccurate report. And the press council found in favor of the hospital. And I can tell you every word in that report was an underestimation of what was going on. Anyway, then the editor of The Guardian very bravely, Alistair Hetherington, and quite unusually, republished the article together with the press council judgment, saying readers may wish to judge for themselves, which of course readers had no way of doing, but it was a good gesture. And then there were 3 weeks worth of letters because it had that titillation then. Some people were very angry and said I'd been lying. Some people were supporting it. I was inundated with telephone calls from people saying, I don't want to give you my name, but you ought to go and see this hospital. I'm a member of staff on this ward in this hospital. I'm a parent. And this I had not been prepared for at all. And in fact, I rather wanted to get away from it, get on with the rest of my life, really. But of course, by then I was morally bound. I was morally bound. I didn't feel I could sit by and see and listen to these things. So I visited a lot of hospitals. I visited a lot of community services which were beginning, and was able to give them publicity and say, look, it doesn't have to be the hospitals. It doesn't have to be that. Then in 1969, 2 things happened. Men walked on the moon. Thank you, Liam. And there was a report into a hospital in Cardiff called Ely. And it was the first official report that really described systemic breakdown of this system. And the government had sat on it, it turned out, for about 9 months, I think, because it was so shocking they didn't want to publish it because they'd have to do something. But eventually it was published in 1969. And then people began to be aware that, things were very bad, very, very bad for people with learning difficulties in hospital. And the government set up a task force to try and look at ways to make reforms. And a young architect called Sandra Franklin was involved with this. She was the girlfriend of one of the people working on the task force. She was very upset at the way the government thinking was going. She thought it was patching up a corrupt system rather than any kind of radical reform. So she got in touch with me because I was known to be interested in that field. And we were both so indignant that we wrote a long paper, a sort of manifesto. And we went to an international conference in Dublin, and we put a copy on every single delegate's chair. And there was a lot of anger. We hadn't asked permission. Who were we anyway? And of course, because I was in the press then, I could get a lot of publicity from my friends. So we got good publicity for that paper. And memorably, the chap who was running MENCAP at that time inveighed against who are these 2 mini-skirted girls, he said. But fortunately, we had some supporters, and one of them was a wonderful man called James Loring, who ran what was then called the Spastic Society, now called Scope. And he said, well, you can't leave it there. You've got to start an organization and do something about it. So he gave us a very small office in the basement of the Scope offices and wonderfully printing facilities. They did all our printing for us. And because we became very keen on publishing reports as time went on, that was a great boon and a blessing to us. So Sandra made a letterhead because she was very artistic, and it was purple, and it's a campaign for the mentally handicapped, and we were in business. And by then, because of the publicity, perhaps, people have begun to sort of get in touch with us. And two of the first were, well, if not the first, were Peter and Paul, I think. Yeah. So that's over to you now about your first bit.
Shall I carry on? Because I'm probably the next in sequence. Yeah.
Were you the next? Yeah.
Well, I'd worked in one of these institutions in 1963 and was pretty horrified by what I saw there. I then went to university and became friends with a man called Peter Moss. He and I started volunteering at a hostel for children with learning difficulties, and we stayed in touch afterwards. I had a job. I got a degree in psychology and got a job working in a research team in Hampshire, which was supposed to be objectively evaluating whether people could be taken out of hospital and housed in much smaller units close to their communities. I had, I think, met Anne at a conference, I think, of the British Psychological Society. I can't remember quite when it was, but I did know of Anne. And of course, I read her articles and things in The Guardian, which impressed me very much. In the research team in Hampshire, we'd also been visited by Sandra Franklin and her companion, Kenneth Bayes, who were working on the architecture of small units with the Department of Health. We were also visited by Anita Hunt, as she was in those days, who was a researcher in what was then the Spastic Society, now called Scope. And she later married James Loring. So there were strong links between her and the director of the society. So I had met Anne and Sandra and Anita. And I can't remember exactly how it happened, but after your manifesto was distributed and it was suggested that you set up an organization, you got in touch with me and said, would you like to join? And of course, I was delighted to be invited, and I said yes, and went up and met them all and put my name to various documents saying that I supported this campaign to remove people from institutions. Of course, my job was to objectively research whether this was a possibility or not. So I was in really deep trouble at work for having committed myself to the research results before we'd actually done the research. But in retrospect, I think it was silly research, really, because it was more or less doing research on apartheid. Is apartheid a good idea, or can people live equal in conditions of equality? It's a political question, not a scientific question. So that's how I came to see the research. But it wasn't a waste of time because, it led to all sorts of contacts and developments. Having been in touch with Peter throughout those years, it seemed natural to suggest to Peter that he might join as well. So, as Anne said, Peter and I were more or less the first couple of members of CMH, and we set to the task of helping to write publications, and that was how it started. Peter, do you want to be next?
Yeah.
How you got involved?
Okay. Well, before I say something about myself, just pick up on a couple of things which have been said already. Anne's talked very vividly about these places that were called subnormality hospitals. And I think it's important to remember that at that time, I think I'm right in saying there were between 60 and 70,000 people, children and adults, labeled as mentally subnormal living in these places. And often they were enormous institutions. I think the hospital Anne wrote about in The Guardian had about 2,000 people living in it. I mean, these were huge asylums. And today, although there are still some hospital places left, I think it's difficult to kind of imagine just how bleak and awful and vast and dehumanized that these places actually were. And many people spent most of their lives living in them, unless they were fortunate enough to have somebody advocating for them and to get them out. And the other thing that strikes me, I'd just like to mention, is the terminology. I mean, we started off calling ourselves Campaign for the Mentally Handicapped. And of course, today, mentally handicapped is no longer in use, quite rightly. But, you know, that was in a way the best of the language. I mean, the language of subnormality, people will clinically label with terms like idiot and imbecile and feeble-minded. And, you know, when I hear people going on about woke and politically correct, it makes me very angry, because language is so important in how we understand and treat and value people. And this whole language created an image of people with what we would now say is having learning disabilities as others, as basically subhumans. So I think it's really important to kind of get that idea together. Just picking up on what Paul has said, yes, I got drawn into all this in a very kind of serendipitous way. I was studying history, nothing to do with any of these subjects at university. And one day I saw a postcard on a notice board in a college from somebody called Paul Williams, saying there was this hostel for children called mentally handicapped children then. And would anybody like to come and help him volunteer there, which I did. And I very quickly became completely absorbed in the place, and with working with these children, with people like Paul and the staff there. It was a small hostel run by the local authority, which provided an alternative to children having to go into hospital. So it was exactly the sort of idea that we came to advocate for. And because of that experience, when I eventually finished my history course, instead of going on to being a historian, for reasons not entirely clear to me now, I went on to do a social work course. And after the social work course, I briefly worked in a children's department before getting a job at London University Institute of Education with a guy called Jack Tizzard. And before I hand over to Alan Tyne, I think I should just bring him into the discussion, because Jack Tizzard is perhaps forgotten by many today, but is a very important figure. He was a social researcher originally from New Zealand, who after the war came over to the UK and became involved in research into people with learning disabilities, and was very much involved in looking at alternative ways of providing services for them. And his most famous work was something called the Brooklands Project, where he actually took a group of children labeled as mentally handicapped out of one of these great big awful hospitals and put this small group into an ordinary domestic home, treating them in the same way as children without a disability would have been treated, who couldn't be looked after by their parents. And he was able to demonstrate that these children who had been consigned to hospital but now were being out in the community did just as well, in fact better, than children who were left in hospital. So the Brooklands project, in a way, provided some ammunition for those who were to go on and advocate for abolishing hospitals and actually providing for people with learning disabilities in the community. So Jack Tizzard was a very important figure, and he was able to set up a research unit at the Institute of Education, and that's where I got a job, and that's where I am today. So I think, and in the course of that short history after doing social work and having kept in touch with Paul, as he mentioned, I then got drawn into this rather ad hoc, rather informal group of a few individuals, which was Campaign for the Mentally Handicapped. And I think on that note, I'll hand over to Alan Tyne, who to pick up.
Well, I know what it's like to stand on the shoulders of giants. In the late 1960s, I was teaching sociology to trainee teachers in Lancashire. And a new Education Act came into force, and one of the establishments that was quite close to the college where I was working became a school instead of being a junior training centre based in a hospital. And so our students began visiting this school. Overnight, the door, the sign that said centre was taken down, and the sign that said school was put up, and it was expected to get on and be educational. And the young teacher, who was the sole trained teacher in the establishment, was just looking for any help she could get for anywhere. So our students were like a godsend to her, and they came back and they said, we're thinking it would be a really great idea if we did some volunteering up there, because these children who live there, about 120 of them, they're really quite lonely, and they don't really, very few parents ever visit, and they have no contact with the outside world. We ought to get up there. And since you're staff, you can drive the college bus, so you could take us there. So that's how that was my qualification for starting in on this journey. I could drive the bus. So, and that's what we did. We visited several times a week and got to know people, and gradually got to know some of the staff, and started being a bit inquisitive and visiting other bits of the hospital that we hadn't previously been shown, and learning more and more. And during that time, an inspection was carried out by the Department of Education, and a lady by the name of Maureen Osman was amongst the inspection team. And I spent some hours with Maureen, and apart from anything else, she passed on to me a copy of this interesting little article that you may like to have a look at. It was called "Even Better Services for the Mentally Handicapped." It had been written by one Ann Shearer. And so that was my first contact with CMH. And over the next year or so, I began to reshape the course that I taught on sociology and social policy, and started to dwell more and more on the work of people like Maureen and Jack Tizzard and others. So I was kind of learning it as I went along. And then the opportunity came to leave that job and go to Essex University and do a degree where I did some research for a year in social policy for people with learning disabilities. And I really didn't have much of an idea of what I would do at the end of that year. But again, something turned up, and suddenly there was this job at CMH as a research officer, which I applied for, and I was lucky enough to get. And that was a wonderful introduction to a world that I'd only just begin to sort of peck at the edges of, really, and begin to understand a little about. And that year, for our family summer holiday, we went to Scandinavia and spent the last of the money that we'd saved as a fairly well-paid college lecturer, and toured Scandinavia. And while my family relaxed on sunlit beaches, I wandered around institutions and some more modern services that were being established there, and came back sort of fired up with ideas, really. At that time, I think CMH had two major thrusts in its work. One was a whole body of work exploring the idea of participation, equal participation between disabled and non-disabled people, and how this could work, and where it could go and what it could do. I I think at that time we were as much interested in doing that as learners rather than as teachers. The other bit of it was the policy strain, really, looking at the faults and failings in the currently established policies and trying to find examples of where different policies were being implemented and where different kinds of outcomes in people's lives were being created. And so for the first 2 years of my work with CMH, I was on the road a great deal of the time. I was travelling around the country and then eventually occasionally across to Europe and even to North America, looking at good examples of things and meeting up with other people who were looking at really changing the way in which services were provided. And we were then very much focused on services, what professionals could do different than what they were doing at that time. The world of parents was a kind of slightly opaque one to us, because although we knew some very fine parents and they were part of CMH and so on, the parent movement as a whole was very, very sceptical about the kinds of ideas that CMH was putting forward, even diametrically opposed them. And the disabled people's movement was still in a germinal stage, really, and many physically disabled people who I met at that time were deeply sceptical about whether there could be any common cause between them and these people who lived in the mental handicap institutions and so on, and whether anyway departing from the institutional model was a good idea for anybody. So things were formed very, very differently at that time, and allies didn't come in large numbers. You had to pick them and cherish them, and so our support came a little at a time. Professionals too were deeply sceptical. Nursing staff were very frightened that with the disappearance of the institutions, their jobs would go, and what would they do then? And they came out with some fairly strident voices opposing the kinds of changes that CMH was putting forward. And I well remember a conference in Birmingham where Dame Peggy J, who was at that time compiling her J report on the future of services for people with learning disabilities, took the platform, and she was howled down by nurses, and over the top of the sound of people baying out, their really displeasure at the kinds of things that she was putting forward. She bellowed loudly, "The NHS does not exist in order to provide you with jobs." So it was a pretty kind of robust and not altogether productive kind of debate that was going on there at that time. But we have many, many fine professionals who were very strong allies of CMH, but very often were unable to declare that openly. They were in a position where if they nailed their colours to the mast, they felt that might affect their careers, their work conditions, and other things too. So professionals were caught in a very difficult trap. So another part of my work at that time was to write CMH's evidence to the J Committee, and that proved to be quite a lucky thing to do, really. And it was picked up, and it was. I wrote it with the collaboration of a lot of other people in CMH. It wasn't just my work. I merely gathered the ideas together. But quite a lot of that report, our response to the J Committee, went into their final report, and that was quite a useful step to take. And that had some very helpful outcomes in terms of offering people different career paths, different patterns of working, and so on. But it was curious that at that time we were still not thinking so much in terms of encouraging and helping disabled people to tell their own stories. We were very much focusing on telling the story that we could see, both about how things were. I spent a year traveling around, staying in residential accommodation for people with learning disabilities all around the country, and sleeping nights in big wards where 65 men were, and I doubt whether I get permission to do it nowadays. I'm sure there's all sorts of regulations it was breaking, but at the time you walked in and you said, "I'm a researcher," and they said, "Fine, help yourself," and it was a wide open door. And so a lot of the time we were documenting what was happening and what was wrong, but at the same time we were working hard to collect examples of ways that things could be better, both for the people who were on the receiving end of services and for the people who were providing them. How much more interesting, how much more rewarding it could be to work in a service of this new kind. So that was really my work over that time. And by the end of the 70s, things were already very, very dramatically changing, beginning to change. And it was a very optimistic time. If you think that it was only another 10 years or so on and Mandela was released from jail and the Berlin Wall came down, we were building towards something at that time. It was a very optimistic kind of time in which to live. It really did seem as though big and significant changes in people's lives could be accomplished. Anyway, I'll stop there.
We did come in on a rising wave, didn't we? With all the, you described so eloquently, Alan, all the opposition, which was quite considerable. I mean, it could reduce you to tears. Sandra spent a lot of the Dublin conference crying in the lavatory. It could reduce you to tears because people were caught, you know, where it mattered to them. But at the same time, it was a time when two women could make their own letterhead and set up an organization which got publicity in the press. It was the time of the pressure groups, wasn't it? Little pressure groups. We phoned up the Department of Health when Keith Joseph was minister and said we'd like to tell him what was wrong with his policy. And we got a phone call back saying, come to tea. And we went to tea with the Minister of Health. And he listened very courteously. I don't think that would happen now. Huh? So it was a time of opening. It was a time, just a little window. I think we came in on that. And of course, the multiple reports of conditions in the long stay institutions were grist for the mill of the reformer. Of course they were. Yeah.
Yes. I think there were. Is there a whistle when I talk? So I don't know what to do about that. But anyway, I think there were two things that strongly picked up the ideas that CMH was. Is it any better if I come closer? No, a little bit better. There were two things in particular that assisted the ideas that CMH was proposing. One was the conferences that we started doing, that Ann started with the Our Life conference in 1972. And that's really led to the development of the self-advocacy movement. It was a strong influence on the developing of the self-advocacy movement throughout the world, really, particularly in America. And I think CMH can genuinely claim to have been a catalyst in that movement. The other thing, as Anne has already mentioned, was this continuing revealing of scandals in the hospitals themselves. There was also a particular incident in 1972 when 30 patients were killed in a fire at Cold Harbour Hospital in Dorset. I was slightly against using that as part of the argument because it was a tragedy for everyone involved, for the families and the staff and everyone who knew them and was associated with the hospital. But nevertheless, it was quite an important event, I think, in convincing the Department of Health that these places had something seriously wrong with them and that there must be a move to close them. The white paper, Better Services for Anti-Handicapped, had suggested a reduction of about half in the number of places in hospitals. But of course, Anne and Sandra and CMH were arguing that everybody should be out, that there was something inherently bad about the institutions for anybody, not just the most able half that could be out. So that began to, I think, be appreciated by more people.
Could I come in on that? Because I think we can also see that in a way CMH was riding the zeitgeist. That is, if you can ride a zeitgeist, I'm not quite certain. The spirit of the times. Because I think after the end of the Second World War, lots of people were institutionalized, people who were labeled mentally handicapped. But of course, lots of other groups, for example, children in care lived in large village communities, and people with psychiatric illnesses were put into large hospitals and so forth. So and then there was a movement, or a movement emerged after the war against this idea of institutionalization, about warehousing people, as some people called it, this stacking of large numbers of people into one place. And there was a lot of reaction against that by academics, as well as by groups representing those who suffered this. So, and it's not just, I think, in the field of learning disabilities. In many other fields, we see the movement away from this idea of putting together large groups of people, not only putting them together, but in a way shuffling them out the way, because the whole point about people being in these large institutions was that nobody outside really knew that they were there. They were effectively segregated. So the other side so there was a de-institutionalization movement, and the other part of that was a move towards integration into communities and into normal services, which is a bit like Alan was mentioning, the sort of precursor of that, the idea that that people with disabilities should be able to share the same sort of experience, the same sort of life as everybody else. So I think we were fortunate, or I'm not sure that's the right word, to be coming into being at a time when things were going, when there was an openness to change, shall we say. And therefore, in a sense, we were pushing against a half-open door. But as has been mentioned, the other half of the door was actually firmly shut by people who didn't want to change. And I suppose the two things, but it was partly a case of getting people out of big institutions, but also then how did you create environments and lives which really were better than being in institutions. It wasn't just a case of moving people, it was actually a case of offering them a totally different way of life.
Yeah. I'd like to just go back to what Paul was saying, because the door was half open. That's absolutely true, Peter. But I think we made some very good, and I think you were a wonderful chairman for all those years. You really were. You kept us on track. You were great. But we did three, I think, very good things. And the first was that right at the beginning, we involved people with learning disabilities, as Paul was saying. You know, our first conferences, they were the first to be held anywhere that I've heard of outside of Sweden, which is where we got the idea. And that was a very, very good thing to do. The second thing was that from the start, we were research-based, action research, as Alan was saying. And we were tireless in looking for good examples. And we were very lucky to have a lot of good friends on the other side of the Atlantic, particularly, who helped us find the good services. And there were some very pioneering things going on in different parts of the United States. And we could come in on that. And so from the very start, we had a very international perspective, which was quite unlike any other organization in the field at that time, I think. They were very much, well, embedded in the practical, I think. And the third thing was that when Alan joined us, we had a choice, as far as I remember. I may be wrong. We had a choice. Either we could appoint somebody to do the administration, because believe me, what was it, 6 years with the Gestetner machine making those reports? I mean, we did work very, very hard. And we had a choice to have an administrator or to have a research officer. And we decided to have a research officer. And I think that was a good thing to do. So those are the three things I look back at with some pride, actually. I think we did good. We did good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're coming back to the stream now. So obviously, well done to all you brilliant people. Fantastic. So we're not done yet, though. So you're still staying on the camera. So we've got plenty of questions for you guys, though. So we're doing a question. So everyone knows our Q&A is. So we've got question and answer session now. So a question for all the panelists. So I'm going to show you guys on screen the questions that we have for you guys. So obviously, I'll give you the question and you guys can choose whether Paul answers it or Peter or Anne, Alan. So basically, you guys can take turns of us answering questions. So the first question we have here is from Norma Curran. And she says, can you describe the energy in the room the first time that you brought people with lived experience together? So obviously, you guys can choose who would want to go for that question.
Well, I think Anne's probably the best to describe that first conference, the Our Life conference, which was really...
Am I? Were you not there?
Yes, I was there. Yes, I wasn't very involved in organising it, but I was. That was great. Yes.
I think what I remember is apprehension. Apprehension. We were very apprehensive. The people who came, did staff come to that one?
Yes.
Yeah, staff came as well. They were varyingly interested and skeptical. And the people with learning difficulties had never been to Castle Priory Residential College before either. And so I think there was quite a lot of apprehension. Yeah. And a certain amount of sabotage, I think, on the part of the institution. They didn't really want it to succeed. But that said, we very quickly had a good time together. And of course, the discussions were terrific.
Mm-hmm.
People describing their lives and just what people aspired to was so much what the rest of us take for granted. You know, a place of their own. I mean, yes, yes, of course, not to be bossed about all the time, to be able to choose, So it quickly, I think, developed into something very, very exciting. And we had a good time together. Yeah.
It was a totally novel experience to me when I first started working with CMH, was to go to a participation event. And I was fascinated by it. And we all sat around on the first evening and were a bit puzzled because a kind of a pattern had developed in some of the discussions that the non-disabled people would ask questions and the disabled people would answer them. Mm-hmm. And so the discussion became a very kind of one-way traffic kind of an affair. So we decided to create a rule that if you ask a question, you then got to answer it for yourself. And the next day, you know, we were back in discussion groups again, and a director of social services who was there was sending questions out. And he said, and have you got a girlfriend then? And a young disabled man said, yes, I have actually. Have you got a girlfriend? And the director said, well, I don't really think that's relevant here. And everybody else said, oh, yes, it is. You've got to answer. It's the rule. And people suddenly felt strong. It was all right to ask a director of social services if it got a bit on the side. And that's so it was empowering in all sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm.
The other question, another question that quickly disappeared from the agenda was how much do you earn?
Yeah.
You know, a person with learning difficulties would say, I earn 2 and 6 a week. And the director would have to confess that he earned £56,000 a year. So,
I do think that those conferences, and Paul and Alan took them on very much and developed them, I think. They were interesting because they were about equal participation. You know, they were about just trying to introduce them and us together. And I still think that's very, very valuable kind of approach. It's one approach, but it's a valuable one, I think. Yeah.
Can I show you a little image that I've got here? This is a picture of myself and my wife Bonnie with a lady called Elizabeth Brown. Peter and I knew her first met her in 1964 when she was 9 years old. That's a picture of us having lunch with her the other week. She's now 66 years old. So there's been a lifetime of participation with her. So it's just a nice thing to catch hold of, and our relationship with her has been very much one of equality, I think, throughout the years we've known her. So that's the sort of thing we were trying to facilitate in those days.
Right, thank you guys for answering that question from Norma Curran. Thank you. Our next question comes from Simon John Duffy, and he says, do you think it has become more harder for academies to play an active role in working towards social justice and inclusion?
Who's the academic, Peter?
Probably is the answer for various reasons. I was a young academic when in the early days of CMH, and when I look back on it, I had extraordinary freedom to follow, what was in effect a pressure group, and to have my name on publications and so on. And I think today that would be much harder, partly because many academics have such insecure employment, so they don't have the space to do things on the side, so to speak, and they possibly don't have the confidence to do it either, because they would be afraid of being criticized or told off for doing that. And simply, I think that a lot of academic research, and certainly in the social field today, is actually responding to short-term pieces of work that organizations want other researchers to answer. So you get a 6-month project with a small amount of money, and you're told to get an answer to their question. And I think back in the day, there was more opportunity to actually set alternative agendas and actually to develop alternative work. So I think then you could speak out more. You had more scope to be involved in other activities, and you had more possibility to perhaps research important questions rather than simply having to respond to things that your funder wanted you to do.
Oh, go on, Alan.
I think when we were doing this work that we described to you, we were making it up as we went along. We were catching ideas from wherever we could find them. We were encouraging people to try them for themselves. There were very few rule books about what you could and couldn't do. Nowadays, the system has discovered all this and has decided to regulate it all and to control it and to manage it. And nowadays, people are much more concerned about, whether or not they're following the rules, the regulations, ticking all the correct boxes and so on. People are very frightened of innovating. And the kinds of systems that we have are, in many respects, very oppressive ones. And the formal systems of government have become the guardians of social justice and inclusion. And I actually think it makes it very hard for small organisations like CMH to begin in the field and to make any real progress.
I think on the positive side, there is much more interest amongst academics in things like anti-oppression and anti-racism. So, in courses for students, things like anti-racism are being included much more, and that includes, disability awareness to some extent. The effectiveness of that, I don't know, but at least that's happening more these days, I think.
Okay. Thank you guys for answering that question from Simon. Thank you, Simon, for the question. We've got another question from Norma Curran coming in now, and she says, who were more institutionalized? Was it the staff in institutions or the people with lived experience?
Shall I have a go at that? I think one of the things we found in CMH was that there were some people working in institutions who were quite willing to explore the ideas that we were putting forward. Maureen Osman, who was one of the most creative and energetic people in CMH in the early days, she ran groups for nurses from hospital who could come and talk about their problems and their ideas for the future. And many of them came, saying, yes, we would love to be out in the community. We yearn for the day, when we can behave better and look after people better. Unfortunately, there was always a background of, staff who were bullies and had no real liking or concern for the people they were caring for. But it's important, I think, not to generalize too much about the staff of institutions, because there were good people there. One of our friends who sadly died last year was a man called Hindol Sen, who was a consultant psychiatrist at Starcross Hospital near Exeter, one of the most ghastly institutions in the country. But he was a wonderful man. He was so sensitive to people's needs, and he really worked to try and improve the lot of those people until the time when the hospital was closed, when he became a community psychiatrist, helping people with multiple problems in the community. So it's very difficult to generalize about people, but unfortunately there was this undertone of brutal behavior in the institutions, which was very unfortunate.
Sorry, can I just add a footnote? We mentioned Maureen Osman a couple of times, and I think she really needs to be remembered. She was a teacher in one of these large subnormality hospitals, and she conducted a piece of research which resulted in a book called The Empty Hours, which was an amazing account of the lives of children living on wards in these hospitals, written from a very close experience of those lives. And just coming back to the previous question, in fact, this person, Jack Tizzard, who we've mentioned before, invited her to become a member of his research unit, even though she didn't have all the kind of bells and whistles of academic credentials. Jack recognized that she was an exceptional person who had exceptional insights to offer. So today she wouldn't have been taken on, but in those days she was valued and brought in.
Okay, thank you very much for answering that question, guys. Our next question comes from The Life I Want, and it's actually a question for you, Alan. So, Alan, how did it feel to share that experience of people in institutions? Did you feel the dehumanizing effects others were subjected to?
Yeah, yes, I did. though I had another world to retreat back to that brings me back to some sense of who I was and where I belonged. They didn't. I had all sorts of curious adventures during that year or so when I was traveling around and staying with people in the formal institutions, big places, as I said, wards with 64 men sleeping in one room. I guess if I'd been in the army, I might have gained that sort of experience there, but I didn't, and I wasn't. But it was outrageous, really. But one of the curious things was that after a day or so of doing that, you could quite easily sort of slip into the routine, and you'd no sooner finished one meal and you began to say, what time's lunch, kind of thing, and that was the next marker in the day. And when that was over, then tea would be the next marker in the day beyond that, and then bed, and so on. So, yeah, it was sort of subtle and powerful as well. But I could then get in my car and drive home. And I used to drive home with music playing really loudly and shouting at the world as I went. And I could sort of get over the kind of sheer anger that one felt about that. And at home, I had a family and a whole other life going on, and that was nice. They didn't. They went back to the same routine after I'd gone.
Okay, Alan, thank you very much for that question answered there. So our next one comes from Liz Callahan, and she says, do you think there is a fear that the history of the work you pioneered will or is being lost? How important do you think this history needs to be remembered or not?
As an historian, one of the things I hate to see at the moment is the loss of history. We live very much in the present. For a lot of people, history is irrelevant. I don't feel that at all. And I think one of the important things, perhaps, is that to remember where we came from can strengthen us in going forward. Sometimes I think we can feel nothing's been achieved, can't we? Something goes wrong and everything's so slow and institutions find it so difficult to change. There's apathy where there shouldn't be and things like that. But, if we can look back, and this is by no means just in this field, of course, and say, well, actually, some good things have happened. It can strengthen us to think more good things might happen in the future. So that would be my feeling about history.
All right. Thank you very much, Anne, for answering that question. Our next question comes in from Eden Lewis, and he says, what are your views on the Coming Home report and the group looking at having people with learning disabilities having their own home instead of institutions?
One of the things my wife Bonnie has worked on, she was a manager of community support services, but one of the pioneer things that she was involved in was the provision of accommodation and support for people who wish to live alone. And one of the continuing problems, I think, for many people with learning disabilities is that they have to live with other people that they haven't chosen to live with. That's even if you live in a house for 3 people. If you haven't chosen the other 2 people, it can be just as bad experience for you as anything else. So one of the things that I think Bonnie achieved, but which is still very rare because it is quite expensive, is the provision of homes for people which genuinely is their own home, where they have support. So I think we still need to do some work on what actually constitutes home for people. Unfortunately, if you look at the trend in policy, it seems to be moving away from helping people to have a genuine home of their own, with never-ending rules and regulations and bureaucracy and so on. But there are people still working on trying to help people to achieve genuine homes of their own.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for answering that one. Our next question comes in from Andrew Holman, and he says, do you despair of today's moves to cut services and support to people rather than invest in change for the better?
I suppose the answer is yes.
Yes.
It's and I think what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years, and I think it's been, as Scotland's had as much of a problem as England, has been disastrous, not just for people with learning disabilities either. And we've seen services slashed, and the ability to develop better services completely compromised by a false approach to us under the heading of austerity, which has been a complete disaster. So I do despair. I don't think it was justified or necessary, and I don't think it's justified or necessary now. And I hope that the last 2 or 3 years' experience, one of the better things that might have come out of it is that we should be able to realise that we can and should be able to invest in things that are important without actually putting it off till tomorrow. So I despair, but I think it's hopeful that we could do far better if only we had the courage to do so.
Could I just add that I think one thing that has changed for the worse is the role of professionals. Really. That I used to be involved in a university course teaching social workers, and my job was teaching on work with people with learning disabilities and anti-oppressive practice and things like that. And the students would get all very enthusiastic about it, and then they go off on a practical placement where they would be told your job is to save money. And they would be made to go out and do so-called assessments of people that had a single-minded purpose of saving the authority money. So there was this great contrast between, what people were being taught by people like me in the university and what they had, the job they actually had to do when they were out in the field, which was very frustrating. And I mean, you can still see that going on, that the amount of bureaucracy and financial control that social workers and other people are having to work with is tremendous.
I guess that each of us here, and you too, Andrew, could very well over the next few years be finding ourselves sampling the options that services have to avail themselves to people who need more support and help in life. And it'll be interesting to see what we manage to make of that, and whether we still manage to keep a voice speaking out against it. The thing that's encouraged me most over the years was the work that I did sort of right at the very end of my working career, really, which was with parents and families, and actually working with parents and families to develop partners in policy making, so that the families became as competent, if not more competent, than the professionals in understanding what the options were for their disabled member, and in pressing effectively to get good services for them. And we still meet families every day in North Essex, where we did most of our work, who came up through that process and pushed for and got some really impressive results for their sons and daughters. And I think that one of the things that we learned on that is that you actually can't tell people how to do it. You have to give them the opportunities and provide them with the resources and the information, and they make what they will of it. And as time has gone by, the solutions are changing, they're different. The families are proving themselves immensely resourceful in terms of coming up with good things for their sons and daughters. And that's something that I was really pretty negligent of, I think, when I first started out of my working career. But I think there's great hope there in the movement of parents and families, which keeps regenerating itself with each new generation that comes along. And they have to start back from the beginning and learn it again. But that seems to be a good process.
Okay. Thank you guys for answering that question there. So we got another question now, and this next question comes from Jan. Now, this question seems like a type of question that can be answered by all of you. How can we make change happen? So, off to you guys.
Very few of us are in a position to make change happen. But I think if we can identify clearly what's the nature of the problem, on the one hand, and what's the situation like that we would like to be in, prefer to be in, if we can identify where we are and where we'd like to go, and then begin thinking with other people who have a vested interest in that situation, what kinds of resources are available, what kinds of people are available to help to shift us along that path between where we are now and where we want to be. I think some kind of strategic approach like that is likely to produce something, even though it may not be what we originally thought the answer would be, or indeed it may not be the best that we could do.
I think, gosh, it's not given to us, is it, to make change happen? I think everything Alan said about working with parents and families, you know, you give people the tools and they make what they will of them. And I don't think, you know, to make change happen is to live in a tyranny, really, isn't it? But I think where we started, I mean, I know it's a very different world now, but where we started was with a set of principles. And I do think we managed to test everything we did against those principles. And it's really important that with all the pressures, which we'll be hearing about, you know, somebody hangs on to the principles and puts everything against those. And of course, they can be debated, they will change over time, perhaps, but I think that's really important. And the other thing I think is important, which has been implicit in a lot of what's been said, is it's no good preaching. One reason I gave up being a journalist, because I couldn't anymore tell people what to do. But what one can do is say, look, here is something that works. Here is something that changed. And if that can happen there, you know, it's encouraging. But that very practical thing, I think. So it's a combination of philosophy and actually being very pragmatic about what is happening that one likes, and encouraging that and publicizing it. Those are two small things I think of, actually. Yeah.
Could I just add that I think there are two major scenarios that the future might bring. One is a resurgence of these ideas, maybe led by an organisation like VIAS Scotland, you know, but to establish, you know, similar groups all throughout the country that are working on the basis of the principles that Anne talks about, and want to see the original work continuing. The other unfortunate scenario is that somebody's going to come up with a bright idea of why don't we establish a 2,000 bed village, you know, where people can live with their own cinemas and shops and laundry and church, and let's bring them all together and they'll all be happy. Which one will come true? I wouldn't like to guess.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting looking back to when CMH started and the early work, is that actually it was a time of crisis in the field that we were moving into, learning disabilities, which, as Anne was mentioning, with these scandals and so on and so forth. But I think it was also a period actually when people did believe that there were alternatives, that there were other possibilities, and we were. One of our strengths was we were able to articulate those alternatives and actually not only describe what they might be like, but show examples of them. And then I think the experience after that in the 80s and 90s, Mrs. Thatcher's been mentioned already, was we moved into a period when we were told there was no alternative, that we just had to, that the market rule, that we just had to make do with how things were. I think now that we're moving to another period of deep crisis more generally, and that therefore we go back to the importance of having alternatives ready to articulate and to show they can work. So I think there is a need today to be constantly working on the other possibilities, the other alternatives, and actually explaining what they look like, but also showing how in some cases they have been put to work already and what the conditions are that are necessary for them to succeed.
Well done, guys. Sorry, I had to just shoo with my dog out of the room. We've got a couple more questions now. So we got one from Norma Curran again. And she says, were there times when you thought that it was never going to happen? If so, what galvanized you to keep going? Galvanized, sorry.
I don't know what you thought. I never felt it was never going to happen. I had a naive conviction that, good would win. I don't remember. I remember getting very tired. I remember getting very tired because we all worked so hard. But I don't remember thinking, I don't remember giving up, because it wasn't a giving up time. It was a time of optimism, as has been said. But I'd love to hear what you thought. Thought.
I think that's absolutely right. I think it never occurred to me that we were bashing our heads against a brick wall, and what galvanized us to keep going. Speaking personally, it was quite exciting because all these ideas going on.
Nice people.
Yeah, and we were working. Yeah. And it was very convivial. It was a great group to be a member of. It was quite fun.
It was fun.
On occasion. And there were lots of original. It was just, it was exciting. And I kind of, when people slag off the 70s, I actually remember them as being quite an energized period compared to more recent decades in some ways. So yeah, I mean, it did seem hopeful, and it turned out that we were right to be a little bit hopeful.
Well, one of the things that helped tremendously, I think, and is still helping, is a self-advocacy movement, because you had people with learning difficulties themselves standing up and saying, yes, this is what we want. And by and large, it agreed with what we were saying, rather than people standing up and saying, we love living in a 2,000-bed institution, we love being bullied by the staff and so on. People said, yes, we want to be out in the community, we want to be equal, we want to have rights, we want to have a voice. And that was tremendously helpful.
I think it's important to realise that even if you personally can't keep going, things will keep going and things will go on happening, and other people will take up their mantle and will carry on. I see myself as pretty much an outsider to this whole movement now, but I watch it with some joy and enthusiasm at the good things that are happening.
Yeah, I think that's one of the consolations of age, is seeing the wonderful people who are coming up. You know, they're not everybody, of course, but there are some really good people doing good work, and that's really nice. Yeah. I think one thing, Alan, I remember you saying once was, particularly, I think you were talking about your work with Paul on the Wolfensberger models, that you look back and you think how naive I was, because you thought you just had to give them the good ideas and that would be enough, because everybody would see reason. And I think naivete is a great protection also. I think our naivete kept us going in a way.
Hey, thank you, Anne, for answering that. Thank you, guys. We still. Oh, sorry. Was there someone wanted to come in there?
I was just going to add to that one of the.
No worries, Paul. Go on ahead.
One of the things that Alan and I taught was workshops involving a system of evaluation called passing, and the manual for it was thick, 200 pages or something. So we say that at the very least, take it with us to our old people's home, and it can be used for hitting people over the head, or at the very least propping the door open so that we're in contact with the outside world.
I like it.
Okay, thanks, guys. We've got a few more questions left to answer. So our next question, we've got one last question from Simon, then we've got a few more. So the last question from Simon. Simon says that energy for reform seems lacking today. What do you think would be helpful strategies in today's context?
Well, one of the organisations that's doing pioneer work in this area is Simon's own organisation, the Centre for Welfare Reform. And if that model can be replicated and more people doing it, I think that's that would be part of a hopeful strategy. Simon is a real pioneer in this area. So well done, Simon.
Okay. Anyone else want to add on to that, or do you want to move on to the next question?
I haven't been working in this field for quite some time, and I've been involved actually in early childhood for some decades now. But I think the same thing applies. I think this is a period which is both quite worrying and frightening, but also opens up the possibility of enormous change. It raises the question that perhaps, just perhaps, we might be able to move to a better sort of society in general, which is more caring, more sustainable, and more democratic. So it seems to me the energy in any one field, be it learning disabilities or early years, needs to plug into all these other fields where people are doing very innovative, thoughtful work about, and really asking the question, what sort of world do we want? What do we want for ourselves and our children and so forth? So I think the energy for reform needs to come from the fact that we are facing these enormous converging crises, which are both deeply worrying, but also do just about open up the possibility of something much better if only we have the ability to grasp it.
I think maybe we should study the situation of people who are in much worse situations than ourselves. We have friends who live in Russia and struggle to make changes there, where anybody who dares to say anything publicly that conflicts with the official view is likely to be erased from the scene straight away. And yet people there keep finding ways of objecting to what is being enforced upon them, and continue to find ways of getting people together to work for positive change. Maybe we should learn from them.
Okay. Thank you guys for answering that question. Does anyone else want to answer that, or do you want to move on? Sorry, just in case anyone came in there. No, right. So we've got one last question from Liz, I believe. So Liz Callahan says that, now it's a big question, so it's going to take me a bit of time to read on this one. So there is a real fear that we are moving backwards again towards large group homes, setting in large residential care homes again. From your experience, what would you advise us to do to bring about change? Is it a lack of encouragement? Should we to shout louder?
Well, document it, write it down, tell the stories of people. Make sure that the stories get out and are told and retold by people who care. Even if the people who care don't have much power, make sure that they know what the truth is, what's really happening, what the future is likely to hold. I think that's something that everybody can do. We can keep spreading the news, spreading the stories about what people's lives are like and what they could be like. We go back to that, how it was in 1970, really. Let's tell the stories of how it is. Let's see if we can tell the stories of how it could be, and do that more and more. Even if we can only do that just to one another, then that's better than not doing it at all.
I think that's right. That you have to try and provide people with good examples of good practice that they can go and visit and be enthused about. Unfortunately, I think it's still possible to shout loud. The trouble is that people don't listen so much these days. That I protested about all sorts of things to organisations like the Care Quality Commission, and got neutral answer back, or that it's none of our concern. That sort of answer. Whereas back in the 1970s, you could shout, and at least somebody would say, "Well, that sounds interesting. Come and have tea with me." But not these days. But so I think we still have to shout loud about these things, and try and find a way of getting people to listen. But I think, as Alan says, the way to do that is through stories and examples, rather than expecting people to just listen to you shouting.
I think the courage is in keeping going, actually. That's the real courage, I think. Yeah.
Well, we're all keeping going, aren't we, in our own ways?
In our own ways, we're managing. Yeah. Find your good friends and hang together. Find your good friends and hang together. And some of them may be in very unexpected places. Like the staff in the institutions who longed for change, but were hamstrung.
Radicalize your grandchildren is one strategy.
Radicalize your grandchildren. Does it work, Alan?
I don't know. I may not see it, but it's fun.
Okay. Thank you guys for answering those questions. So obviously this has been absolutely brilliant so far. Absolutely amazing panel. So we're now going to move on to our closing statements from everyone here. So it's been such a brilliant day meeting you, Paul, Ann Shearer, Alan Tyne, and also Peter Moss. So it's been brilliant. So we've got 2 more minutes. So if anyone here has any closing remarks, please feel free to say so, and we'll finish the day from there.
Keep going. Yeah. And celebrate the small victories.
And thanks for the opportunity for this little reunion.
It's been lovely, hasn't it? It's been so nice. Thank you.
Yes, I can only second both of those comments, and I think there's a little bit of hope to be had from our history, and also much very good work that has been done since we started up way back in the 70s. Other people have built on that, and that's been enormously encouraging. So thank you all for the work that you've carried on doing.
Yep. Keep telling the stories. Keep telling the stories. That's the thing to do.
Okay, so thank you guys for doing that. So we'll now end the stream from here. So that has now reached our 3:30 target. So again, thank you, Paul, Anne, Alan, and also Peter. So all of you have an amazing day. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you later on. So bye for now, guys. Okay.
Thank you very much, Liam.
No worries. See you later.
Bye, everybody.